Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. I've always found comfort in the predictable. Every morning at 10 a.m. sharp, I walk to the end of my gravel driveway and retrieve the mail. It doesn't matter if it's raining or if the sun is bleaching the asphalt, the timing is a constant. I take the envelopes back to my kitchen table, place them in a neat stack, and open them with a silver letter opener I've owned for 40 years. People think that because I'm retired, my life has become a series of empty hours. They see a 68-year-old man who meticulously records the serial numbers of the $20 bills he gets back as change at the grocery store, and they think senile. They see a man who wears a starch-collared shirt just to eat oatmeal, and they think obsessive. What they don't see is the version of me I left behind at the U.S. Treasury, specifically at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. For 30 years, I was a senior analyst. My job was to look at the noise of the global financial system and find the signal. I didn't hunt people, I hunted patterns. And once I found a pattern, the person attached to it usually went to prison. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of furniture polish and old paper thick in the air, when my son-in-law, Gregory, arrived. He didn't knock. He used the key my daughter, Claire, had given him for emergencies. He walked in with a bottle of wine, a 1996 Bordeaux, and a smile that was a fraction of a second too wide to be genuine. "Arthur, you're looking sharp today. I thought we could crack this open, celebrate a little. I've had a massive win with a new tech acquisition." I looked at the label. I didn't need a sommelier to tell me the label was a high-quality counterfeit. The font on the vintage date was a half millimeter too thin, and the aging on the cork seal was clearly done with a tea stain. It was an amateur's attempt at prestige. "I'll tell you what, Gregory," I said, my voice as flat as a ledger sheet. "I'll get the glasses, but I think I'll stick to water. My doctor says my liver needs to be as clean as my books." Gregory laughed, a loud, hollow sound that echoed off the cabinets. He sat down and leaned in, his tone shifting into that low conspiratorial register that sharks use right before they bite. "Actually, Arthur, I wanted to talk to you about a small liquidity gap, just a temporary thing. I'm moving some capital into a high-yield venture, and I'm about $50,000 short on the bridge loan. I was wondering if you'd be open to co-signing a short-term note using those old Treasury bonds of yours as collateral. It's a formality, really. You'd be out of the debt in 30 days, and I'd cut you in for 10% of the upside." I looked at him. I let my eyes glaze over just a bit, the way he expected them to. I wanted him to see a man who was overwhelmed by the terminology, a man whose best days were behind him. 10%, I asked, tilting my head. "That sounds very generous, Gregory. But those bonds were for Claire's future. Miriam and I worked very hard for those." "And that's exactly why I'm doing this, Arthur, to grow that future, to make sure Claire never has to worry about anything. I just need your signature on this one-page authorization. I've already filled out the boring parts." He slid a document across the table. It was a general power of attorney and asset pledge agreement. It wasn't a one-page authorization for a bridge loan. It was a blank check for my entire portfolio. I picked up my pen. My hand didn't shake. I signed the document with a slow, deliberate script. I didn't read the fine print, or at least I let him think I didn't. "There you go, Gregory," I said. "I trust you'll do the right thing for the family." "You're a lifesaver, Arthur, truly, a legend." He snatched the paper and stood up. He was so eager to leave, he forgot to take the counterfeit wine. I watched him walk out to his luxury sedan. I noted the license plate. Then I went to the sink and poured the wine down the drain. It smelled like cheap vinegar and artificial coloring. I went to my office and opened my black moleskin. 10:45 a.m. Subject, Gregory. Requested 50K bridge. Presented counterfeit 1996 Bordeaux. Signature obtained on restricted form pledge. Narrative, the whale has been hooked. The first crack was the wine. The second was the way he couldn't stop looking at the clock. In my world, the numbers never lie. But Gregory was about to find out that I'd been counting since the moment he walked through the door. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. The house felt different after the front door clicked shut behind Gregory. The air seemed thinner, as if his presence had been siphoning away the oxygen. I stood at the window and watched his silver sedan pull away, the sunlight glinting off his tinted windows. He drove too fast for a residential street. That was another signal. Impatience is the primary driver of the amateur criminal.
The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in what the young people call gaslighting. I prefer to call it a failed audit of my character. Gregory didn't just want my money. He wanted to make sure I was too confused to ever ask where it went. He began a campaign of subtle emotional manipulation that was as transparent to me as a bad balance sheet. He'd stop by with my daughter, Claire, and he'd wait for me to do something routine like checking the serial numbers on my change or winding the grandfather clock in the hall. He'd catch her eye and give her a look of deep, performative pity. "Arthur, buddy," he'd say, putting a hand on my shoulder with a grip that was just a bit too tight. "You already checked those $5 bills twice. Why don't we put the ledger away? It's okay to let go of the details. You've earned a rest." Then he'd turn to Claire and whisper, just loud enough for me to hear, "It's the repetitive behaviors, honey, the early signs. My grandfather did the same thing with his coin collection right before the end. We need to start thinking about simplified living for him. Maybe look into a place where they handle the heavy lifting." I'd just nod and smile, playing the part of the fading patriarch. I'd watch Claire's eyes fill with tears, her heart breaking for a version of me that didn't exist. It was the cruelest part of his game, using my daughter's love as a whetstone to sharpen his own lies. He was making her doubt her father so she wouldn't doubt her husband. Gregory started helping me organize my filing cabinets. He'd spend hours in my office, humming a tune that was perpetually out of key as he moved through my life with a paper shredder. I knew exactly what he was targeting: the original purchase receipts for my Treasury bonds, the paper trail that proved the assets were mine and mine alone. He thought he was erasing the evidence. He didn't realize that for a man who spent 30 years at FinCEN, a paper trail isn't something you keep in a drawer, it's something you build into the architecture of the system. "You're doing such a good job, Gregory," I told him one afternoon, as he held a stack of my old bank statements over the cross-cut blades. "My head just gets so swimmy with all those numbers. It's a blessing to have a professional in the family to keep things straight." "That's what I'm here for, Arthur," his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a man who thinks he's just robbed a blind man. "I'll handle the heavy lifting. You just focus on your little hobby." He didn't see the tiny camera hidden in the eye of the stuffed owl on my bookshelf. He didn't know that every document he shredded had already been digitized, encrypted, and uploaded to a secure server. He thought he was gaslighting me. He thought he was making me doubt my own mind. But I've spent my life looking at the darkness in men's ledger books. Gregory wasn't a genius. He was a cliché. He was a small-time shark who had accidentally wandered into the deep water where the real predators live. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. The house grew quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of stillness that allows the walls to whisper back the memories they've held for 40 years. With Gregory gone and the shredder finally silent, I found myself drawn to the one room he hadn't dared to organize yet.
I retreated to the small room at the back of the house, the one that still smells faintly of cedar and expensive thread. This was Miriam's sewing room. She's been gone for 4 years, but her presence is the only thing in this house that hasn't been audited or appraised. I sat in her velvet-backed chair and picked up a scrap of unfinished silk from the basket beside it. I closed my eyes and let the texture ground me. Miriam was a librarian by trade, and she was the one who taught me that information is only a burden if it isn't indexed. Arthur, she'd told me once, while she was meticulously threading a needle, a man who knows everything but records nothing is just a loud noise in a quiet room. Write it down, date it, file it. That's how you keep the world from shaking. I remembered the night of the Treasury Gala 30 years ago. I was just a junior analyst then, and Miriam had made her own dress, a deep midnight blue that shimmered under the chandeliers. We were surrounded by the sharks of the banking world, men who looked at the U.S. Treasury like a buffet. "Look at them, Arthur," she'd whispered, leaning close. "They think they're the architects. They don't realize they're just the tenants, and the rent is always due." Those Treasury bonds Gregory was so eager to pledge weren't just financial instruments to me. They were the physical manifestation of 40 years of Miriam's frugality. They were the late nights she spent at the library and the early mornings I spent at the office, all saved up so that when the sun went down on our lives, we'd have a fortress that no one, not the market, not the government, and certainly not a man like Gregory, could breach. I ran my thumb over the silk. It was a fragment of a dress she never got to finish for Lily's graduation. Gregory wasn't just attempting to steal money. He was attempting to erase the index of our lives. He was trying to take the security Miriam had spent her life building and turn it into a down payment on his own vanity. He thought he was taking old paper. He didn't realize he was trying to dismantle a sanctuary. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, a sensation that was far more dangerous than anger. It was the feeling of a senior analyst identifying a critical deficit. Gregory had looked at me and seen a man who was mourning his wife. He failed to see that a man who has lost everything he loves has nothing left to lose, and that makes him the most dangerous auditor in the room. I stood up and smoothed the silk before placing it back in the basket. I didn't say her name aloud. I only do that once a year on her birthday, but I felt her presence behind me, reminding me to check the math. "The rent is due, Gregory," I whispered to the empty room. I went to my office and pulled a loose floorboard under the rug. Inside was a small fireproof floor safe. I didn't keep gold in there. I kept my true ledger, the one with the handwritten notes, the cross-referenced serial numbers, and the digital keys to the FinCEN back channels I'd spent 30 years maintaining. I sat at my desk and opened the book. The sorrow was still there, but it was now anchored by a very specific, very clinical resolve. I wasn't just protecting my pension anymore. I was protecting the girl in the midnight blue dress. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. The house grew dark, but I didn't reach for the light switch. I didn't need the keys to find the truth.
I'd spent decades in the gray room at FinCEN, where the only thing that mattered was the flow of the digital current. Now it was time to flip the breakers.
Gregory believed he was operating in the shadows. He thought that by using offshore wealth management vehicles and crypto mixers, he was invisible. But he'd forgotten who he was dealing with. I didn't just understand the system. I helped calibrate the very sensors that detect the heat of a fraudulent transaction. I opened my ruggedized laptop, the one with the non-standard encryption. I began by performing a UBO search, ultimate beneficial owner. In the old days, you could hide behind a shell company in Delaware or the Caymans, but the Corporate Transparency Act changed the game, and I knew exactly which federal databases to tickle to see who was actually pulling the strings. I peeled back the layers of Gregory's G-Summit Capital. It wasn't a wealth management firm. It was a hollowed-out husk, a classic special-purpose vehicle designed for one thing: a pig-butchering scam. He wasn't using my Treasury bonds to secure a bridge loan. He was using them as whale collateral. He'd show my $2 million bond portfolio to other, smaller investors to prove he had institutional backing, luring them into his crypto mixers before draining their accounts. He'd already moved $500,000 of other people's money through a series of nested exchanges in Eastern Europe. But then I found the fatal error. Gregory was arrogant, and arrogant men always skip the paperwork they think is below them. He had failed to file a FinCEN Form 114, otherwise known as an FBAR, Report of Foreign Bank and Financial Accounts. For a man moving the volumes he was moving, failing to file an FBAR isn't a clerical error. It's a felony, with a penalty of up to 50% of the account balance per violation. I sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting off my glasses. I felt a cold, surgical satisfaction. I wasn't an obsessive old man recording serial numbers anymore. I was a senior analyst, and I had just identified a Level 1 systemic threat. "I'll tell you what, Gregory," I whispered to the flickering screen. "You wanted to play with the big boys' toys, but you forgot that every toy in this sandbox has a serial number, and I'm the one who keeps the log." I began drafting the suspicious activity report, but I didn't send it through the front door. I used a priority-coded channel to a former colleague in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I didn't just give them a tip. I gave them a ready-to-file indictment, complete with the transaction hashes and the metadata from the documents Gregory had shredded in my office. Then I saw the final piece of the puzzle. Gregory had initiated a transfer request for my bonds to be moved into a commingled escrow account next Thursday. The destination? A digital wallet associated with a known money laundering syndicate. He wasn't just stealing my money, he was selling my identity to the very people I'd spent my career putting in cages. I closed the laptop. The audit was complete. The doubt was gone. I knew exactly what Gregory was, and I knew exactly how he was going to end. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of tea. I didn't use a mug. I used Miriam's fine bone china. I sat in the dark, sipping the tea, and waited for the clock to strike midnight. The hunt was no longer quiet. It was just waiting for the sun to come up. The tea was cold by the time I finished, but my mind was as sharp as a fresh blade. I had the numbers. I had the trail. But the audit was about to reveal a cost I hadn't factored into my projections.
I heard the back door click open at 7 a.m. It wasn't Gregory's heavy, arrogant stride. It was a lighter, more hesitant footfall. I stayed in my office, watching through the cracked door as my daughter, Claire, walked into the kitchen. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat at the table, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking in a way that told me she'd been crying long before she pulled into my driveway. I walked out slowly, still playing the part of the slightly slowed-down father. "Claire, you're up early, honey. Is everything all right?" She looked up, and the sight of her face made the blood in my veins turn to ice. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked exhausted. "Dad, I'm so sorry. Gregory said there's been a mistake with the investments. He said that because you were confused when you signed the papers, the bank is flagging everything. He said we might lose our house because of the legal fees to fix your errors." I sat down across from her, my hands folded neatly on the table. "Is that what he told you?" "He said he's trying to shield you from the fallout, but the federal people are asking questions. He made me sign some papers last night, Dad. He said I had to be the guarantor for a new company to bridge the gap. He said it was the only way to save your reputation." My grip tightened under the table, out of her sight. I knew exactly what he'd done. He hadn't just used me as the whale. He'd used Claire as the guarantor of record for his shell company. By having her sign those documents, he had effectively made her the legal fall woman. If the G Summit House of Cards collapsed, which it was designed to do, Gregory would walk away with the crypto, and my daughter would be standing in front of a federal judge facing charges of money laundering and bank fraud. He was using her as a human shield. "Claire," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat, "did you read the papers he had you sign?" "I tried, but he was in such a rush. He said if we didn't file them by midnight, the audit would start and they'd freeze your accounts. I just wanted to protect you, Dad. He said you weren't yourself anymore." The fury that rose in me was unlike anything I'd felt in 30 years at the Treasury. It wasn't the cold, clinical anger of the audit. It was the protective roar of a man seeing his child being led to the slaughter. Gregory wasn't just a thief. He was a predator who was willing to let his own wife go to prison to cover his exit. "I'll tell you what, Claire." I reached across the table to take her hand. Her palm was cold. "I want you to go upstairs and lie down in your old room. I'm going to make a few phone calls. I think Gregory might have misinterpreted the situation." "You aren't mad?" she whispered. "I'm not mad at you, honey, not by a long shot." I watched her go upstairs. Once the door closed, I didn't reach for the tea. I reached for the phone. I called a man named David Miller, a special agent in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division who I'd mentored 20 years ago. "David," I said, "it's Arthur. I'm calling in that favor from the 98 offshore case. I have a controlled delivery of a level 1 fraudster. But there's a complication. My daughter's name is on the filings. I need a non-target letter and a full immunity carve-out for her before I hand you the keys to the vault." "For you, Arthur, anything," David replied. "What have you got?" "I've got a man who thinks he's a shark. I'm going to need a team ready for a founder's dinner tomorrow night. And David, tell them to bring the heavy ink. We're going to be writing a lot of warrants." The motivation was no longer about Miriam's bonds. It was about the girl sleeping upstairs. Gregory thought he had used these last 14 days to bury me. He didn't realize I had used them to build a cage. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real. The house was quiet, but it was the silence of a watchmaker's shop, full of tiny, unseen gears turning in perfect synchronization. Claire was asleep upstairs, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt clean. Gregory thought he had used these last 14 days to bury me. He didn't realize I had used them to build a cage.
Gregory was a man who believed in the big play. He thought that if he moved fast enough and used enough jargon, he could outrun the light. But I didn't need to outrun him. I just needed to be where he was going before he got there. Here is what I did not tell Gregory and what I did not tell Claire. When I signed that pledge agreement in Stage 1, I didn't use my normal pen. I used a specialized restricted entity stamp, a small transparent dry seal I'd kept from my days at the Treasury. To the naked eye, it's invisible, but to the high-speed scanners used at the Federal Reserve's clearinghouse, it's a red flag marker. The moment Gregory tried to move those bonds into his commingled account, he didn't just initiate a transfer, he tripped a Silent SAR, a suspicious activity report. He had effectively called the police on himself, and I was the one who had given him the phone. Layer 1, the metadata poisoning. Every digital document Gregory helped me file was routed through a secure bridge on my laptop. I didn't just record him, I embedded tracking pixels and metadata watermarks into the files he uploaded. These markers didn't just show what was being filed, but where it was being filed from: Gregory's home office, his wealth management suite, and even his mobile device. I had mapped his entire digital footprint before he'd even finished organizing my first drawer. Layer 2, the offshore bait. I accidentally left a printout of a fake offshore account. Gregory was a man who believed in the big play. He thought that if he moved fast enough and used enough jargon, he could outrun the light. But I didn't need to outrun him. I just needed to be where he was going before he got there. Here is what I did not tell Gregory and what I did not tell Claire. When I signed that pledge agreement in Stage 1, I didn't use my normal pen. I used a specialized restricted entity stamp, a small transparent dry seal I'd kept from my days at the Treasury. To the naked eye, it's invisible, but to the high-speed scanners used at the Federal Reserve's clearinghouse, it's a red flag marker. The moment Gregory tried to move those bonds into his commingled account, he didn't just initiate a transfer, he tripped a Silent SAR, a suspicious activity report. He had effectively called the police on himself, and I was the one who had given him the phone. Layer 1, the metadata poisoning. Every digital document Gregory helped me file was routed through a secure bridge on my laptop. I didn't just record him, I embedded tracking pixels and metadata watermarks into the files he uploaded. These markers didn't just show what was being filed, but where it was being filed from: Gregory's home office, his wealth management suite, and even his mobile device. I had mapped his entire digital footprint before he'd even finished organizing my first drawer. Layer 2, the offshore bait. I accidentally left a printout of a fake offshore account summary, a Kyrgyzstan sovereign wealth account with a balance of $1.2 million. I knew Gregory's greed would act like a compass. He didn't just see the money, he tried to hack the account using the credentials I'd conveniently written down in the back of my moleskin. By attempting to access that account, he wasn't just committing local fraud, he was committing international wire fraud and violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Layer 3, the controlled delivery. I had David Miller's team at the IRS set up a shadow escrow. When Gregory's money laundering syndicate tried to pull the funds, they weren't pulling from my Treasury bonds, they were pulling from a seizure-ready account monitored by the federal government. Every dollar they moved was a documented felony, and every person who touched that money was now a target of a multi-agency task force. Gregory thought he was the founding partner of a new financial empire.
He had scheduled a high-stakes founders dinner for tomorrow night at a private room in the city's most expensive steakhouse. He was planning to onboard 3 new whales, using my daughter's signed guarantees as the ultimate lure. "I'll tell you what, Gregory," I whispered, looking at the blinking cursor on my screen. "You wanted to host a dinner. I hope you brought an appetite, because the bill is finally coming due." I checked my watch, 10 p.m. I walked over to the grandfather clock and wound it, the heavy weights rising with a rhythmic, mechanical click. Tomorrow night, Gregory would stand up to give the speech of his life, and I would be there to provide the closing remarks. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. The restaurant was called the Gilded Oak, the kind of place where the waiters wear white gloves and the menus don't have prices. It was a cathedral for the overreachers, and Gregory was at the pulpit. He'd rented the private wine cellar, a room lined with thousands of bottles of dust-covered history, surrounded by glass and stone.
I arrived at 8:45 p.m. I wasn't invited, but in my world, an auditor never waits for an invitation. I was wearing the same starch-collared shirt and the same navy suit I'd worn to the Treasury for 30 decades. I carried my old leather briefcase, the one with the brass latches that click like a handcuff locking into place. Through the glass door of the cellar, I saw them. Gregory was standing, a glass of crystal-clear gin in his hand, holding court. 3 whales, men with expensive watches and soft hands, were leaning in, mesmerized by the digital projections on the screen behind him. Gregory was showing them the G-Summit growth charts. He was showing them the guaranteed backing of my Treasury bonds and Claire's signature on the master fund. I opened the door. The heavy oak swung on silent hinges. The laughter at the table died instantly. Gregory's face went through a fascinating spectrum of colors, from celebratory flush to a sickly pale yellow. "Arthur?" stammered Gregory, setting his glass down so hard some of the gin splashed onto the white tablecloth. "You don't want to drive into the city alone, buddy. We talked about your confusion." "I'm not confused, Gregory," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had that dry, institutional authority that usually makes bank presidents start sweating. "In fact, I've never been more clear. I'm here to provide the closing remarks for your prospectus." I walked to the head of the table. The 3 investors looked at me with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "Gregory," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "I brought you a gift. I know how much you like prestige." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single stapled document. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a draft of a Title 31 federal indictment. I slid it across the table. It landed right in front of him, on top of his G-Summit brochures. "What is this?" hissed Gregory, his eyes darting toward the door. "It's your history," I said. Section 1 explains the FinCEN Form 114 violations. Section 2 details the international wire fraud you committed when you tried to access a sovereign wealth account I set up as a honeypot. And Section 3, well, Section 3 is the immunity agreement for my daughter, Claire. It turns out, when you use a federal analyst's daughter as a human shield, the federal government takes it very personally. One of the investors, a man with silver hair and a sharp suit, reached out and grabbed the document. His eyes widened as he read the first page. "Federal indictment? Gregory, what the hell is this?" "He's lying," hissed Gregory, his voice cracking, reaching for the paper. "He's an old man with dementia. He's obsessed with serial numbers." And "I am obsessed with serial numbers," I said. I looked at the table.
For instance, I've been tracking the serial numbers on the earnest money you took from these gentlemen. Every dollar you moved into your crypto mixer was flagged by the shadow escrow I've been monitoring with the IRS for the last 72 hours. You're not moving money, Gregory. You're moving evidence." Gregory looked at the door again, but it opened before he could move. David Miller walked in, followed by 4 men in tactical vests with IRS-CI in bold yellow letters across their backs. The room went cold. The whales scrambled to their feet, their faces masks of pure panic. "Gregory Miller," said David, stepping up to the table. He didn't look at the investors. He looked at the man who had tried to bury me. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of money laundering, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to stay silent." Gregory didn't go quietly. He started babbling about misunderstandings and market volatility. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. "Arthur, please, I did it for Claire. I did it for the family." "No," I said, as David's team pulled Gregory's hands behind his back. The click of the steel cuffs was a sound I'd heard 100 times, but it had never sounded quite this rhythmic. I watched them lead him out past the white-gloved waiters and the stunned diners. I watched the whales being read their rights as witnesses. I stayed in the cellar for a moment. I picked up the bottle of gin Gregory had been drinking. I looked at the label. It was genuine. At least he had the decency to buy the good stuff for his final meal. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool city air. David was waiting by his SUV. "We've got the servers, Arthur, and we've got the crypto keys. Claire is completely clear. The non-target letter is in your briefcase." "Thank you, David," I said. "I'll see you at the hearing." I drove home slowly. I didn't rush. I stayed exactly at the speed limit. In my world, the numbers always tell you where you are, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I was going. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. The city lights faded in my rear-view mirror, replaced by the familiar, comforting dark of the suburbs. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the clock on the dash read 11 p.m. The house was glowing from within, every light left on, a beacon of anxiety I was finally about to extinguish.
6 months is a short time in the eyes of the law, but it's a lifetime in a ledger. Gregory is currently residing in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. The judge, a man who had seen his fair share of financial predators, wasn't moved by Gregory's liquidity gap defense. Between the FBAR violations and the wire fraud, he's looking at 12 years. He tried to call Claire once from the processing center, but the non-target letter I'd secured for her came with a very specific set of conditions. She was to have no contact with the architect of her potential ruin. The G Summit assets were liquidated. Because of the Silent SAR and the shadow escrow I'd helped establish, the recovery rate for the victims was nearly 90%. That's a miracle in the world of crypto scams. I received a letter a few weeks ago from one of the whales at the dinner, a man who had nearly lost his daughter's college fund. He didn't ask for a refund. He just asked how I'd seen the signal in all that noise. I didn't reply. Some secrets are better kept behind the vault door. Claire is back in her own house now. The guarantor documents were shredded, legally this time, and her credit was restored to its pristine state. She comes over every Sunday. We don't talk about the G Summit or the wealth manager. We talk about the garden, the weather, and the way the grandfather clock needs to be oiled. She looks at me differently now. There's no more pity in her eyes, no more talk of simplified living. There is only a quiet, newfound respect. I'm sitting at the kitchen table now. The morning sun is hitting the linoleum in long, sharp angles. I have a $5 bill in front of me, change from the hardware store where I bought a new latch for the garden gate. I pull my black moleskin toward me and uncaps my pen. Serial number MK8230411B. I record the number with a steady hand. People still look at me at the grocery store and see a man losing his grip on reality. They see a relic of a bygone era, obsessing over paper in a digital world. They think I'm counting because I'm afraid of forgetting. They're wrong. I'm counting because I'm the only one who knows the true value of the currency. I'm counting because Miriam taught me that the index is the only thing that keeps the world from shaking. I look toward the back of the house, toward the sewing room. The silk fragment is still in the basket, but the room is no longer a shrine to a ghost. It's a playroom now. I can hear my grandkids in there, their laughter echoing off the walls Miriam loved so much. The audit is closed. The books are balanced. In my world, the numbers never lie. It's just a matter of who's doing the counting, and as long as I'm breathing, I'll be the one holding the pen. I close the ledger and click the brass latches on my briefcase. 10 o'clock. Time to check the mail.